Hello everyone. Welcome to the lecture on narrativization of culture. This lecture is part of your course on media, culture and society. In this lecture, you'll be introduced to one of the processes of mediation, that is narratives. Narratives are a part of mediation where a resolution of the conflict takes place within the text as well as context. We will look into the meaning and construction of narratives. We also will discuss nature of narratives, which will give you an idea of its relation to social world. You'll be introduced to the works of prominent thinkers such as Vladimir Trop, Frederick Jameson, Mikhail Bakhtin, in understanding the role of narratives in our everyday lives. This lecture will equip you to critically analyze any form of narratives that you encounter through different forms of media. It will help you to understand the encoding process of narratives and their functions in relation to the understanding of self, culture, identity, and society. Now, let's start with the idea of meaning of narrative. Before we move ahead, it is very important to understand the concept of narrative itself. In commonsensical term, narrative is understood as a tale, a story, a recital of facts. It is a verbal act where someone tells a story to someone about something that has happened. However, for understanding it in terms of communication studies, we need to understand it as a process of creating a story, the internal logic of the story, that is the plot, and the theme of the story, and also the product, that is the story itself. Narratives provides a sense of the present by bringing the elements of past, creating a unity between them and giving a purpose of life. It should be noted that narrative is closely linked to the identity formation for both individuals and groups. Richard Kearney summarizes the narrative constitution of identity as such. You recount your present condition in the light of past memories and future anticipations. You interpret where you are now in terms of where you have come from and where you are going, and so doing, you give a sense of yourself as a narrative identity that perdures and coheres over a lifetime. Similarly, David Kerr also highlighted the role of narrative in the construction of communal identity by pointing out that at whatever level of size or degree of complexity a community exists, whenever a narrative account exists of a we, which is continuous existence through its experience and activities. This indicates that there is no disruption, rather continuity with the past and future in order to understand the present. This also exemplifies how narratives are used by human beings to understand their temporal existence. To quote Paul Ricoeur, who states, "Time becomes human to the extent that it is articulated through a narrative mode, and narrative attains its full meaning when it becomes a condition of temporal existence." All these imply that narratives are quite significant and have a primordial role in creating, defining, and defining the self-culture and the social life world of groups and individuals. Now, we discuss about understanding narratives. In understanding the process of mediation and decoding, one of the approaches has been to look into the narrative structure of the text. The main argument of this approach is that the solution to a problem is encoded within a narrative. Extending further, it points out that both encoding and decoding through constructed within the narratives through process of identification, nevertheless, they are not necessarily equivalent. Narrative structures become the basis for cultural interpretation. The narratives of the media or cultural texts incorporate the social contradictions that we face in our everyday lives and reconcile these contradictions within the text. The audience identifies with these contradictions and their solutions. Before we proceed further, we need to understand how is narrative constructed and what is its nature. We discuss about making of narrative. We can understand the making of narrative through following three steps. One is from a series of past events and characters, few are selected and appropriated. But only those events and characters are selected which are relevant to the current crisis situation, so that the audience who listen to them can identify with the present scenario and arrive at a solution to the crisis. The selected events are temporally ordered and presented with a beginning, middle, and an end. It is quite important that a chronological order is followed in the construction of the narrative. The structure of the narrative has a pattern which is unilinear in nature, having a beginning and an end through the climax, that is the middle part. These events and characters must be related to one another and to some overarching structure known as a plotment. This is to provide some logic about how and why the recounted events occurred. One of the strategies employed in narratives is to provide a flow, logic, and justification for the occurrence of an event. This enables the audience to engage with it in a better manner. For example, Sitakant Mahapatra, in his study Folk Hero in a Tribal Society, found that creation of the folk hero in the Indian folk tales is a way to interpret its own tradition and to enhance cultural self-image. Folk tales, according to him, are usually linked to present degeneration of social norms and try to find out the causes of such decay and to seek remedy for the present situation. Heroes possess intellectual and emotive qualities. Their qualities inspire the group and is built into the personality structure of the group through the process of socialization in childhood. People try to imbibe the qualities of the hero and look up to him as an ideal. Now, we discuss about the nature of narrative. Now that we have understood how a narrative is constructed, that is through the selection of characters and events from the past which are relevant to the encountered conflict and its careful chronological ordering into beginning, climax, and ending so as to engage the audience. We need to now understand the four natures of narratives. That will give you an idea about how a link is forged between the past and the present and how it acquires prior importance in the maintenance of social world. Storytelling is a socially organized phenomenon and does not occur randomly. It implies that lots of permutations and combinations of facts, events, myth get churned in the process of storytelling. It occurs within a social context, not in a vacuum. It is planned carefully and with a message or strategic interest. The content of narratives is guided by social norms and values. Since it has to be told within a society or community, they do not try to digress from the norms of the society. One of the functions of narrative is to instill values within a community and as such has been crafted to serve this purpose. Storytelling is not only about when and what kind of stories can be told, but also how the stories are told. This is known as narrative transaction. This includes the tone, pitch, action, gestures, and other non-verbal communication techniques employed to say the narrative. Narratives are not just stories told within the social context, but are also social practices. It is very important to maintain the practice of storytelling so that the message, values, identities are carried on to the future generations. Now, mediation through narrative process. In this section, we will discuss how narratives act as a mediator between the text and the audience. To understand this, we will refer to the works of three prominent thinkers, Vladimir Propp, Frederick Jameson, and Mikhail Bakhtin. Vladimir Propp talks about resolution of conflict within the text in a unilinear fashion or a syntagmatic reading, whereas Jameson and Bakhtin propose to look into narrative as an opposition between multiple texts or paradigmatic reading. Let us look at each of these viewpoints in detail. Morphology of folktale, that is Vladimir Propp refers to. Morphology can be understood as a description of the folktale according to its component parts or acts and the relationship of these parts with each other and to the whole. Vladimir Propp studied Russian folktales and analyzed the units of the plot narrative structure, which he termed as the function. Functions can be defined as an act of the character, defined from the point of view of its significance for the course of the action. He identified 31 functions of the folktales, which is commonly found in a folktale. However, it is necessary that all the functions will be available in one folktale. The 31 functions of folktales identified by Prop are as follows. One of the members of the family absents or dies himself from the family, older, younger, or death. An interdiction or a big rule is addressed to the hero. The big rule is violated. The villain and hero learn about each other. The villain receives information about his victim. The villain attempts to deceive his or her victim and takes possession of him, her, easily through persuasion, deception, magical means, or coercion. The victim submits to deception. The villain causes harm or injury to members of a family in the form of abduction, bodily injury, or casting a spell. The hero is approached when any misfortune befalls. The seeker and the hero agree to or decide upon counteraction. The hero leaves home. The hero is tested, interrogated, attacked, etc. on his path. The test basically is for receiving either a magical agent or helper. The hero clears the test or outsmarts the actions of the future donor. The hero acquires the use of a magical agent. The hero is transferred, delivered, or lead to the whereabouts of his object of research. The hero and the villain join in direct combat. The hero is branded for his efforts with something material or mark on his body. The villain is defeated. The initial misfortune is liquidated. The hero returns. The hero is pursued by the villains. The hero is rescued from the pursuit. The hero, unrecognized, arrives home or in other country. A false hero presents unfounded claims. A difficult task is proposed to the hero. The task is resolved. The hero is recognized. The false hero or villain is exposed. The hero is given a new appearance or makeover. The villain is punished. The hero is married and ascends the throne. You can identify many of these functions, sometime in the chronological order or in many of popular Indian folk tales. But what is communicated through these 31 functions is that each of these is significant to carry out the message of the folk tale. The conflict is raised within the folk tale and is resolved within it. A distinction between good and bad character is maintained, and the message of the triumph of the good over the evil is conveyed to the audience. Such folk tales are used to instill the values of the hero into the minds of the young generation and to convey the message that if you do good, at the end of any conflict you will win. This might not happen in reality, but a possibility is put forward through such narratives. People will relate to such tales while dealing with any crisis situation in their day-to-day life. Narrative as a symbolic act, as Frederick Jameson says. Now, let us discuss the viewpoint of Frederick Jameson suggests narratives as social symbolic act. According to Lawrence Grossberg, the most significant contemporary use of narrative theory within Marxist cultural interpretation can be found in the work of Frederick Jameson. In his book, The Political Unconscious, Narratives as a Socially Symbolic Act, Jameson considers narrative as a social and symbolic act through whose structure the history is produced and there is a mediation of reality and fantasy. According to him, the social has merged into the cultural and is evident in a consumerist society. He suggests that the encoding of the narration in the text has a bearing on the social mode of production associated with the inherent class contradictions that guides the construction of the narratives. In order to explain this, Jameson gives an example of how he received and interpreted history. He argues that history is a real materiality which is made available to use us through text. The reality is mediated to us through what he calls as ideologies, that is, interpretative paradigm. These interpretative paradigms are a result of the past events and interactions. The mediated text that we receive undergoes a process of transformation within a cultural context. It is in this manner that history is constantly deconstructed and reconstructed within the narratives. This process of narrativizing maintains the distinction between economic base and superstructure as pointed out by Marx. For example, if we look into the origin of subaltern history in India, there was a need to retell the history from the perspective of the marginalized, that is Dalits, women, tribals, peasants, etc., whose voices has been silenced in the writings of Indian history. Similarly, the feminists criticize history as a body of knowledge which is constructed in a manner that privileges a male viewpoint, thereby citing history as his story. The resolution provided through the narrative structure remains confined to the realm of symbolic or ideological and does not filter down into reality. For example, the book Netherworld discusses in detail how the middle class sees the slums, fantasizes about them, and provide an imaginary solution to repress the class anxieties that exist in reality. The middle class perceives these slums to be a menace in urban planning and development, but they are dependent on the slums as it provides for domestic health, cleaning of roads, drains, and other menial jobs, in absence of which the middle class will find it difficult to operate in the city. So the solution offered in the narrative of urban planning and development is proper rehabilitation of the slum dwellers with good facilities of health and education made available to them. However, such solution seems to be a distant reality and is confined to realm of ideological. This shows how the economic base controls the superstructure. It is through the construction of such narratives that the ideological function of the text tries to repress the contradictions in real life is revealed. Through projection of an imaginary solution, these narratives conceal the real possibility of their resolution. It serves only an utopian function to celebrate the symbolic possibility of a real transformation. Dialogical imagination and carnival, Mikhail Bakhtin refers that the last viewpoint is that we are referring to is Mikhail Bakhtin. Mikhail Bakhtin considered literature to be a web of discourses drawn from separate social sources. According to him, any cultural text needs to be read in terms of intertextuality with works of different authors. Any piece of work is an engagement with the previous work done on the same topic. This is what he calls as dialogism. For him, meaning cannot be viewed in isolation, rather always in relation to others. It implies that we are constantly engaged in dialogue, not only with people, but also events, objects, experiences, etc. He suggests the four natures of dialogue. That is the nature of dialogue we refer. The first one is it is a continuous process and as such does not end. It does not occur between fixed positions or subjects. It has the potential to transform individuals. It can even bring about social change. Bakhtin's analysis of literary texts through the concept of dialogism can be extended to understand society and culture. It implies that there exist multiple perspectives, voices, and subjectivities in the social world. In his book, The Dialogical Imagination, he extends his analysis of dialogism through the concept of heteroglossia. It emphasizes on the process of combining different pre-existing statements to construct a text. These statements are from all kinds of literature, not divided by social hierarchical structure. Bakhtin argues that originality of the author does not lie within the text. Rather, it is the very act of combining the existing statements that defines the originality of the author or producer of the text. According to him, the creation of a unified language superimposes a kind of centralized power. For example, when a language is considered to be standard and pure, it is basically the language of the elite. Such hegemonic language, he argues, suppresses or stifles the heteroglossia of the existing multiple everyday speech types. The different types of speech are compelled to conform to the official style, which is dominant, in order to be recognized as part of a privileged speech community. In Bakhtin's sense, Texts that attempt to establish a fixed truth or that repress otherness are referred to as monoglossical or monological. Bakhtin points out that such monoglossical dominance of a particular language or text will not last long, as it will be challenged and interrupted by different other voices. Due to existence of multiple languages in other cultures, there is development of feelings of ethnocentrism and xenocentrism. Ethnocentrism refers to a feeling of superiority where one tends to believe that his or her culture is superior in comparison to other culture. On the other hand, xenocentrism refers to the feeling of inferiority when one compares his or her culture to that of others. In order to overcome these feelings, the notion of cultural relativism is put forth. According to the standpoint of cultural relativism, no culture is superior or inferior, rather each should be understood as a separate and autonomous. Culture should be judged through its own cultural standards and conventions rather than being undermined or challenged by other cultures. The dominance of a particular culture is challenged by other cultures. This is emphasized by Bakhtin through his example of carnivalesque. Carnival is a mode of folk culture which constitutes an oppositional life lying outside the confines of the closed and dominant official realm. The second world is characterized by its oppositional nature and ambivalence. For example, in an official feast, rank and hierarchy will be reinforced through display of uniform and sitting arrangements, whereas in a carnival feast, there will be no such hierarchies. People enter a utopian realm of community, freedom, equality, and abundance, where a special form of free and familiar contact reigned among people who were usually divided by the barriers of caste, property, profession, and age. Victor Turner also gives an example of carnival in Brazil, where people come on the streets into a rally displaying certain symbols, dress, and themes which they never talk about in their everyday life. The boundary between the private realm and public domain get blurred. The street becomes a liminal space where there is no hierarchy and everybody participates. Similarly, in Odisha, during the car festival of Lord Jagannath, the devotees are allowed to touch the idol of the deity, indicating that the distinction between purity and pollution has dissolved, as the idol is not the sanctuary of the temple but in a chariot on the streets. What we find here is that it is in these momentary spaces that the problem is mediated and resolved, but it does not disappear altogether. The hierarchies continue to operate but are subverted during the carnival or festivals. In conclusion, I would like to conclude by saying, therefore, in this lecture, we learn that narratives are always oriented towards others. All stories, however diverse, have one thing in common. Someone has to tell something to someone. There is always a storyteller and story taker, that is an implied audience. I hope it is thus clear that narrative is an intersubjective form of discourse or communicative act oriented towards other. Narratives help in defining ourselves in reference to the narratives provided by others. We learned that the encoding and decoding becomes never-ending process and always open to multiple interpretations. We learned the scholarly viewpoints towards narrativization of culture, which helped us recognize the various ways in which a text can be read. Thus, narratives help in the process of mediation by offering solutions within the text, which is appropriated within a context. For more details, please read the e-text of this lecture properly and attempt the questions in the end. Thank you.